Mark Carney just got back from Alberta yesterday afternoon, and then he's going to have a cabinet meeting today, and then, next week back on the road. He's really running up his travel miles these last few weeks. So the first trip is to The Hague. There's going to be in the Netherlands. He's going to be meeting with officials from NATO. So every year, the leaders of the NATO countries get together, talk about sort of shared priorities, their shared concerns. Obviously, the situation in Ukraine, because NATO is very much a Europe-focused organization. The situation in Ukraine, now in this war, now into its fourth year, is the number one concern, as always. But also, they will be talking about the situation between Israel and Iran, the exchange of missiles that seems to be worsening. What's the U.S. response going to be? That's a big question. And then, of course, the ongoing conflict in Gaza. But the number one topic will very much likely be spending. How much is each NATO member country spending? This is something that goes back to 2014 when the federal government in Canada under Stephen Harper, as well as all the other NATO member countries, agreed to hit a spending target of 2% of our gross domestic product. So that's the defense spending as measured by a share of our economy. Of course, Harper never achieved that when he was the prime minister. Justin Trudeau didn't achieve it either and left office saying he was going to hit that target by 2032. During the election campaign, Mark Carney pledged to hit it in 2030 and now has dramatically sped up that projected timeline. Keep in mind, this is only a projection. This is the government saying they're going to hit that figure by the end of this current fiscal year. So that's by the end of March. That is very likely news that's going to be well received by NATO. In fact, at the G7 in Alberta, in Kananaskis, Alberta, Carney, on the sidelines of the summit, met with NATO's Secretary General Mark Rutte, who's also a former Prime Minister of the Netherlands, where they're going to be meeting. And that was obviously something that Rutte brought up immediately before the television cameras, congratulating on Canada getting to that target. But there is new pressure on all the NATO member countries to increase their overall spending to 5% on military. That would be a massive increase for Canada, tens of billions more in defense spending, including new equipment purchases. Very unlikely Canada would get to that level. In fact, there are only a couple of NATO countries that are currently spending that level. I think Estonia and maybe Greece or Turkey are kind of at that level. But in case of Estonia and Greece, their total GDP is much smaller, so it's easier to spend a bit of money to get to that percentage. Not even the Americans are spending at that level yet. I expect Carney at NATO will push back against this idea, saying it's too aggressive right now, and that Western economies faced with all these tariff issues, sort of the turmoil in the global marketplaces, will not want to do that. And then when he goes on in Brussels to meet with other European leaders about this trade relationship between Canada and Europe, this is again Trump's tariffs front and center in that conversation, because everyone around the world is trying to figure out a way to build these new trade and security alliances to kind of wean themselves off dependency on the United States, because it is proving to be such an unpredictable trading partner. Of course, Canada already has a pretty major trade agreement with the European Union called the CETA, Comprehensive Economic and Trade Agreement, that's been in place since the Harper era. Seems to be functioning pretty well. Carney looking, though, to expand that, to broaden it, to encourage more trade between Canada and European partners, and also talking about getting involved in European defense more. So a big component of that, obviously, is our commitments to NATO. But are there also other avenues where Canada could cooperate more with the European Union on defense issues? That's something they're going to be looking at. And crucially, keeping the procurement of defense. So if you think there's a sort of a two-piece equation here, if we're committing at NATO to spend a lot more money on defense, Canada wants to spend that as much as it can with domestic suppliers here at home, rather than, as we currently are spending about 80% of our defense procurements are purchased from the United States. Can we also look to Europe as a supplier of defense? And the one big item there on that list are the F-35s. We're currently under contract with Lockheed Martin, an American company, to buy those very, very expensive jets. But we've only committed to sort of the first batch of those, which are going to be delivered, I believe, later this year and into next year. The remaining larger share of the contract could be canceled. Carney has talked about taking a second look at the decision to buy the F-35s from Lockheed Martin. Possibly we could buy from a European company. The big one, the top one on that list would be Saab, the Swedish automobile manufacturer, also makes defense equipment and has an airplane called the Gripen that Canadian officials did look at when they tendered the contract for the F-35. So that could be possibly back on. So a real focus on this trip, Mel, on trade and on defense spending.